History crowned him a legend, but the truth? It was buried under censorship, propaganda, and the fog of war. This is not the Churchill you learned about in school.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a really deep exploration of a figure who's probably one of the most recognized symbols of British defiance, certainly in the 20th century, Winston Churchill.
That's right. I mean, when you think about the standard story, Churchill is just cemented, isn't he? The savior of Europe, the guy who stood up to Hitler.
Absolutely. And the basic facts, they speak volumes. Born 1874, died 1965, this incredibly long career, over 60 years in Parliament.
Yeah, shifting between conservative and liberal parties, an aristocrat, a writer too, Nobel Prize for Literature in '53. Quite the resume.
He really is, by almost any traditional measure, you'd say a historical hero. But what happens when we look at source material that deliberately sort of steps around those familiar stories, material that focuses instead on, well, alleged blind spots, maybe suppressed histories of his actual policy decisions?
And that's exactly what we're trying to do today. We're unpacking what is, frankly, a radical counter-narrative presented in these sources. It's a critique that doesn't just add complexity, it fundamentally challenges that hero status.
It goes further than just criticism, though, doesn't it?
Oh, much further. The material we're looking at today argues that the accepted image of Churchill isn't just incomplete, it's fundamentally flawed. It concludes, pretty starkly, that he was, and I quote the sources here, a war criminal and mass murderer.
Wow.
Yeah, specifically because of what they describe as his consistent authorization of tactics that targeted civilian populations.
Okay, right. We definitely need to unpack that. That's the core conflict, isn't it? The celebrated savior versus these documented or alleged policies involving mass civilian deaths, unconventional warfare. It's a heavy accusation.
It is, and it demands we take a really careful look at the specific arguments, the facts, as presented in this source material.
Okay, let's start then. To begin this re-examination, the sources take us back to World War I. Churchill had a key role there, didn't he? First Lord of the Admiralty.
Exactly, in charge of the Royal Navy. And his actions in that role, according to this critique, established a kind of strategic pattern. The big one, the most devastating action they focus on was the naval blockade against the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary.
And this wasn't just stopping weapons getting through.
Yeah, no, it was designed as economic suffocation. The explicit goal was to systematically cut off the enemy nation's ability to feed itself, to target the entire civilian population's access to essentials.
So food, medicine, the basics.
Absolutely. We're talking basic food staples, fuel for heating, critical medicines needed to treat, common diseases, prevent malnutrition. It was aimed right at the civilian populace.
And the source material argues this was, what, total warfare from the outset?
That's the argument.
Right.
And the moral issue, according to this critique, it gets even deeper when you look at the timing. This is where it gets really quite disturbing. The armistice was signed in November 1918. Fighting stopped.
Right.
But the British blockade, it was kept in place for months afterwards, all the way into the summer of 1919.
Why? What was the reason for continuing it after the war was over?
Well, the sources argue it was used as leverage, a political tool during the peace negotiations at Versailles, which were incredibly harsh on Germany. Basically keep starving them until they sign. So
the starvation of civilians wasn't just a byproduct of the war. It was a deliberate policy after the fighting stopped.
Okay.
How? How bad was the human cost? Does the source material quantify that?
It does. And the figures cited by the historians in our sources, they're just staggering and often overlooked, really. Later estimates suggest that this prolonged starvation policy led to the deaths of over 700,000 civilians.
700,000.
Yes. I mean, put that in perspective. That's a civilian death toll higher than the combat losses of several major countries in that war.
And these weren't soldiers, the victims, as the source points out.
Mm-hmm.
They were specifically non-combatants, right?
Absolutely. The source really hammers this point home. It was a policy aimed squarely at the most vulnerable. The majority who died were women, children, the elderly. People succumbing to starvation itself, or diseases linked to malnutrition, or illnesses they couldn't treat because medical supplies were blocked.
And historians cited in the critique called it.
They didn't mince words, described it as the conscious starvation of an entire nation.
Conscious starvation.
Anyway.
After the armistice. It's a detail that almost never comes up in the popular Churchill story. why does the critique focus so much on this specific WWI action? What's the significance later on?
Well, the source argues it's essential because it establishes a pattern. Right at the start of his high-level career, that number, 700,000, it's huge. And yet the source claims Churchill was basically never held accountable for it in official histories.
So the critique uses this to frame what comes later.
Exactly. It reveals this fundamental willingness to use total war tactics, to weaponize something as basic as food, regardless of the massive civilian cost, as long as it achieved a strategic or political goal.
It sounds like the source is saying this set a kind of moral precedent. If mass starvation is okay, then what's off the table?
That's precisely the connection the material draws. It suggests this early acceptance of famine as a tool. It paved the way for a much broader, maybe more ruthless approach to getting victory later on. The ends justify the means, no matter the human cost.
Okay, so if the WWI blockade set a precedent for targeting civilians through hunger, the critique then moves on to his advocacy for other controversial weapons, right? Chemical and biological warfare.
Yes, and it's important to understand this wasn't just a fleeting idea. Churchill was apparently a pretty staunch supporter of using poison gas, and not just in WWI.
He argued it was more merciful. That sounds counterintuitive.
It does today, absolutely. But the source material explains his argument. Apparently, he claimed gas often incapacitated people rather than killing them instantly, so theoretically it caused fewer outright deaths than, say, high explosive shells.
That's a difficult argument to accept looking back. But this wasn't just theory, was it? The critique says this advocacy led to actual use.
Precisely. It wasn't just talk. The source documents its proposed use in WWI, sure, but then later, its actual deployment in conflicts in the Middle East and India, places where Britain was dealing with colonial uprisings.
So, using gas against insurgents.
Yes, and critically, the source claims, even against civilian populations who might have been shielding insurgents or just living in areas of resistance, so it shifts from a potential battlefield weapon to a tool of imperial control, used pretty indiscriminately against communities.
That's a very different context than the trenches at the Western Front.
Completely different. And the critique argues it shows a willingness to deploy these kinds of weapons strategically, wherever deemed necessary for control.
And it gets even more intense when we move from chemical to biological warfare experiments later in his career. The Grenard Island case that's mentioned prominently in the source material, what happened there?
Grenard, yes. It's quite something. During World War II, Churchill apparently approved these highly dangerous biological tests. Grenard Island, it's off the coast of Scotland, was selected as the test site.
For what exactly?
For bombs filled with a particularly nasty strain of anthrax. The idea was to see if they could effectively disperse anthrax spores from the air as a weapon.
Anthrax bombs. Tested on British soil? What were the consequences?
Massive and long-lasting contamination. The anthrax spores were incredibly resilient. They spread widely. The island became heavily contaminated, totally uninhabitable, and had to be quarantined for decades.
Decades.
Yes, until a huge, expensive cleanup operation finally happened in the late 1980s. The source uses this example to show the extreme risks the government, under Churchill's authority, was willing to take in pursuing biological weapons.
So Grenard was about testing feasibility. But the source reveals this wasn't just an experiment. There was a specific, terrifying plan called Operation Vegetarian. What was that?
Operation Vegetarian, planned between 1942 and 1944. It's genuinely chilling. It was this dystopian scheme, really, designed to cripple Germany by starvation, similar to the WWI blockade, but using disease. The plan was to drop millions of small cakes laced with anthrax spores over Germany. These cakes were designed to look like animal feed, attractive to livestock. The goal was to wipe out Germany's cattle and other farm animals, destroying their food supply from the inside.
Millions of anthrax cakes. This wasn't just a vague idea then. The preparation was serious.
Oh, totally serious. The source emphasizes the scale. Millions of these bioweaponized cakes were actually manufactured, stored, ready for deployment by the RAF. The logistics involved were huge. It shows a real commitment to potentially carrying out this mass starvation via biological attack.
And the only reason it didn't happen, according to the source,
was that the tide of the war turned. Allied bombing and ground advances made it strategically unnecessary. It wasn't canceled because of moral concerns, the critique argues, but because it was no longer needed for victory.
So if the war had stalled?
The implication is yes, this plan for mass biological starvation might well have been executed.
If we link this back then, the WWI blockade, now chemical and biological warfare advocacy and planning, What does this pattern tell us about Churchill's approach to winning, according to this critique?
It raises that crucial question again, doesn't it? It suggests, for the authors of this critique, an almost complete lack of restraint regarding the methods used. Churchill, they argue, repeatedly blurred the line between targeting armies and targeting the basic life support systems of entire civilian populations.
Food, medicine, the food chain itself.
Exactly. It points to a consistent philosophy, according to the source. Mass civilian suffering is a strategically acceptable tool if it helps achieve victory.
This consistent willingness to target civilians brings us squarely into World War II, which is, of course, where his legacy is most defined. And the source connects this pattern directly to the air war, doesn't it?
It does. It highlights Churchill's absolute refusal to negotiate peace with Hitler. He committed Britain to total existential war. And that, the source argues, necessitated adopting strategies that aimed to destroy not just Germany's military, but its society and infrastructure, too.
And there's a specific, very controversial claim in the source material about who started the bombing of cities.
Yes, this is a key point in the critique. It claims that Churchill authorized the bombing of German cities, specifically residential areas, before Germany launched the Blitz against British cities.
So effectively opening the door to strategic bombing against civilians, breaking that threshold first.
That's the argument presented. The critique focuses on evidence suggesting early British bombing missions under Churchill deliberately targeted civilian areas to cause terror and break morale. Now, the standard narrative often points to the Blitz starting it all.
Right.
But the source material emphasizes the shift in policy. Who first made the strategic decision to deliberately attack non-military urban centers as a way to win the war? The critique points the finger at Britain under Churchill.
And the stated goal was explicitly to break civilian morale, to make the German population give up.
Yes, to collapse the war effort from within through terror and suffering. And the source uses Churchill's own words here, which are quite stark. He's quoted as talking about turning Germany into a desert.
Into a desert? That's not subtle. It implies devastation far beyond military targets.
Exactly. And this rhetoric, the source argues, translated directly into the strategy of mass area bombardment, what we often call carpet bombing.
And the human cost of that strategy, how does the source quantify it?
Horrific. The source states clearly that these bombing campaigns led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of German civilians. And it stresses this wasn't just collateral damage. The civilian residential areas were the targets. The aim was destroying housing, killing workers, shattering morale.
And to achieve this level of destruction, he approved new kinds of weapons, too.
Yes, weapons specifically designed for creating mass fire and destruction. The source details the authorization for using phosphorus bombs, which caused terrible burns, and significant experimentation with other new incendiary devices. The goal was often to create massive firestorms, like the ones that devastated cities like Dresden and Hamburg.
This source also mentions targeting non-urban areas, like forests.
It does. Which is interesting. It mentions operations targeting large areas like the Black Forest and parts of Thuringia. The aim seems to have been destroying natural resources, timber, maybe even just deepening the sense of total national ruin.
The sheer scale of intentional destruction is hard to grasp. So if we connect this back again, WWI blockade, the anthrax plan, now mass area bombing. What's the consistent thread in Churchill's wartime leadership, according to this critique?
It really completes the pattern the source has been tracing. This consistent use of tactics aimed at inflicting mass civilian suffering, starvation first, then potential disease, and finally fire and bombing it defines his approach to conflict, according to this view.
It suggests a philosophy where the entire enemy population is fair game.
That's the core argument, that he treated the entire enemy nation, its people, its environment, as legitimate targets. That he consistently chose methods designed for indiscriminate mass suffering as strategic weapons, focusing on destroying the social fabric, not just the military machine.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. The source material doesn't just critique the policies. It offers a pretty harsh assessment of Churchill's actual character, trying to explain why he might have approved these methods.
Yes, the personality profile painted in the source is, well, it's incredibly critical. It suggests his policies weren't just cold calculation, but maybe driven by something deeper, more personal. He's described as being fundamentally power-obsessed, reckless, and intensely warlike.
Warlike, as in he sought out conflict.
That's the claim. That he saw war almost as an adventure, the ultimate stage for greatness. The source alleges he was constantly looking for new conflicts to get involved in: Russia, Turkey, Germany, suggesting this deep-seated personal need for the drama and high stakes of war.
And this wasn't just about duty. The source suggests he actually enjoyed it.
That's what the authors claim, drawing on accounts from people around him. They cite witnesses who apparently reported that he genuinely enjoyed wars, saw them as the ultimate test where his destiny lay.
That's a very provocative claim.
It is. And the source also touches on personal habits, noting claims about significant alcohol consumption, large amounts of whiskey daily. The implication, I suppose, is whether this might have fueled recklessness or perhaps lowered inhibitions about the human cost of his decisions.
So this character assessment fundamentally challenges the image of the stoic, duty-bound leader. If the source is right, this personal enjoyment or psychological need for conflict translated into a lack of moral restraint.
That's exactly the conclusion the source draws about his moral compass. The critique argues that he approved mass bombing, chemical warfare plans, starvation blockades with a kind of disturbing ease, even when used against former allies or colonial populations. The argument is that this drive for personal glory, or perhaps just for the game of war itself, overrode humanitarian concerns.
So if you put the character analysis together with the policies, the blockade, the gas advocacy, the firebombing, what's the overall impact of his career according to this critical view?
The summary is starkly negative. The source concludes that his policies, by intentional design, cost millions of civilian lives through starvation, potential disease, and bombing. The narrative presented isn't just complexity, it's of a leader whose personal fascination with conflict meant populations became disposable pawns on a grand strategic board.
It suggests that even the victory over Hitler has to be weighed against this consistent pattern of inflicting mass, indiscriminate suffering to achieve his aims.
Precisely. The source material is essentially demanding we look at a balance sheet that public history has rarely acknowledged. A balance sheet where the heroic victory is on one side, but the consistent authorization of brutal tactics against civilians is on the other.
Which brings us to this huge disconnect, this historical dissonance. How does a figure with this alleged record, according to the source, end up being so universally celebrated?
Yeah, the source really leans into this contrast. It uses specific examples to highlight just how stark the difference is between the critique and his post-war recognition. One of the most potent examples cited is the Charlemagne Prize.
The Karlspreis, from the German city of Aachen.
That's the one. He received this major European prize in 1956, and the citation. It was specifically for his commitment to peace and freedom.
Peace and freedom. Given the source's claims about the WWI blockade killing hundreds of thousands of German and Austrian civilians and the WWII bombing, the irony is unavoidable.
Absolutely unavoidable. And for the authors of this critique, this detail is almost proof of their central argument, that history has been fundamentally falsified, or at least heavily sanitized. How can a man whose policies allegedly caused such devastation in Germany be honored by Germany, specifically for peace? The dissonance itself becomes the evidence of historical manipulation, in their view.
So the source material doesn't just present facts, it actively argues that the popular historical narrative is wrong.
Exactly. It pulls no punches. The conflict between the celebration and the critique is the point. You have the globally revered defender of Europe on one hand, and on the other, this critique labeling him a war criminal, mass murderer, and proponent of chemical warfare.
And the critique's final summary, its overall take on his negative impact.
It consistently boils down to a few key points. First, that he deliberately killed civilians using blockades, gas plans, and bombing as strategic tools. Not accidents, but policy.
Okay.
Second, they argue his policies actually prolonged WWII. That his refusal to negotiate early on, and perhaps his initiation of city bombing, escalated the conflict, accelerated Europe's destruction, and maybe even pushed things towards wider global involvement, including the U.S. entry.
That's a huge claim that his actions escalated rather than contained the war.
It's a major part of the critique, and the conclusion ties it all together. Despite this dark side, this heavy balance sheet, it remains largely hidden in mainstream Western history, which prefers the simple hero narrative.
So for you, the listener, grappling with this, well, this radically different picture of such a famous historical figure, what does it all mean?
I think it really forces us to confront the idea that historical heroism is often deeply complex, maybe even contradictory, that the great man narrative often smooths over some very dark aspects.
That achieving one great thing like defeating Hitler, doesn't automatically erase the human cost of how it was achieved.
Precisely. The ultimate takeaway from the source material seems to be a call for critical evaluation. Look at the policies, look at the methods, look at the means, not just the outcome, however celebrated that outcome might be.
Right. Well, this has certainly been an intensive deep dive. We've really had to unpack some uncomfortable aspects of the Churchill legacy as presented in this critique. We've touched on the estimated 700,000 civilian deaths from the WWI blockade,
His long-standing advocacy for mustard gas, its alleged use in colonial settings,
the truly chilling details of Operation Vegetarian, the anthrax plan,
and, of course, the devastating consequences of the strategic area bombing in WWII, killing hundreds of thousands more civilians.
And we've seen how the source connects these policies to a character assessment that portrays him as reckless, warlike, someone who perhaps even enjoyed conflict. It paints a picture that's just fundamentally at odds with the standard heroic image.
It does. And the critique leaves us not just with historical details, but with this profound question about how history itself is written and remembered. That dissonance is key.
So perhaps the final thought to leave with you is this. If a leader's greatness is often judged by overcoming one huge evil, like defeating Hitler, how should history weigh that achievement against other policies they consistently pursue throughout their career? Policies like blockades, bioweapon plans, carpet bombing, things that, according to this source, led directly to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of other civilians.
Exactly. What's the moral calculus there? How do you balance strategic necessity or perceived necessity against the sheer human cost, especially when the end result is hailed as a victory for freedom? That's definitely something for you to mull over, to explore further as you think about historical figures and the complex, often hidden, layers beneath the surface narrative.
A challenging question indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.